All right, we're being recorded now, so here we go. Hi again, my name is Liesel Ritchie. I'm at Virginia Tech. I'm in Blacksburg right now, so it's just after 2 o'clock. So I'm closer to the weekend than anyone else here. In fact, that was one of the pieces of homework that I was given. What are my short-term goals and my long-term goals? And right now, my short-term goal is to make it to the weekend. So that's what I'm going for. I will start by sharing my screen. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the research that I've done. It's with my partner in life and my collaborator in life too. We are research partners who've been working on disasters and hazards. I've been doing that since 2001, and Dwayne has been doing that since 1987, I want to say. He's on, so he can type in the chat if I'm wrong, and I probably am. So I'm going to start by letting you know a little bit about myself. I won't go too far back and go over my entire life, but I'm going to talk a little bit about why we study disasters. I'm going to talk about social impact assessment, and I'm going to talk about, as promised in the abstract, the community capitals framework. So I said I wasn't going to go very far back, but I was born and raised in Canada. And that's me, of course, very cute. I'd like to think I was just as cute now, but I'm not entirely sure about that. I'm a big fan of the outfit on the next one over. Wish I could find some shoes and a hat like that, and maybe that would get me to the cuter point. I went to Mississippi State where I ran track, and then I decided to get my PhD. I ended up doing my PhD work in Cordova using qualitative methods. I did almost 50 interviews with commercial fishermen and others in the community. I got my deckhands license, and so I spent some time out on the Copper River Flats, and I have a lot of connections to Alaska. I've been to a number of places. Specifically, I've been to Barrow, Cordova, of course, Kodiak, the Kenai Peninsula, Dutch Harbor on Alaska after the Selendang Ayu ran aground, and Kodiak as well, where we did a study of tsunami awareness and preparedness. So that might have some influence on the kinds of work that I would want to do. So I've already mentioned this. I love my pictures of the places I've been and the things I've seen, with the exception of going to places like Haiti in the bottom right corner, where the earthquake occurred in 2010. I've looked recently at the Wakashio oil spill in the Indian Ocean. Not many people have heard about that, and that's in the bottom center. The Tennessee Valley Authority coal ash spill in the bottom left, and the running aground of the Selendang Ayu. I've also looked, as Haig mentioned, at the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. My favorite view in Cordova, I think, is the harbor there. And I've also been doing some work in social impact assessment with First Nations groups up in Canada. So the societal dimensions of hazards and disasters has been studied for decades, literally. The first study dates back to 1917, and that occurred in Canada by Samuel Prince. And there was an explosion of a ship in the Halifax harbor that did tremendous amount of damage, as you can see in this photography. I believe that one of the things that attracts me most to the toxic contamination events that we have studied is that we get an idea of how communities respond and the dynamics associated with that response. So looking at the social responses, we can look at the interaction between humans and their social environment, as well as their natural environments. So studying disasters, this is a slide I typically share with engineers. I gave a lecture a couple of days ago that was to a group of undergraduate and graduate students who are in engineering. And I talked a little bit about the fact that when we study disasters, we are studying literally a microcosm of society. We obviously can't do in an ethical way anything that would put people in harm's way intentionally. So one of the things that we use the disaster research for is to provide information that communities can use to mitigate the kinds of social and psychological conditions that disasters tend to bring about. So I mentioned just a minute ago, psychosocial stress. What is that? That's the uncertainty, the social disruption, the anxiety, and psychological stress that is experienced by individuals and their primary group. But one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that we keep our considerations related to natural and technological or human caused or anthropogenic events on a continuum. So it's not a black and white situation where we have strictly natural or strictly technological. They have overlapping qualities, characteristics, and social impacts. And here we share the continuum of deliberateness. And the deliberateness has to do with how deliberate, just like it sounds like, any of the acts portrayed on this continuum might be seen. So at the far left, we have strictly acts of God. And that's what the insurance company calls things, particularly when they're not necessarily interested in paying up. So those are considered natural disasters. Then on the far right, we have more purposeful, premeditated acts like mass shootings and terrorisms and other kinds of things that are incredibly deliberate. And in the center is where my work tends to focus. Events caused by human error, or a fancy term that was made up by one of my colleagues back in 1993, and that's recreancy. And essentially what that is a situation where there is some entity or some party or organization that's actually responsible for a hazard or disaster. And when they are responsible, there's a lot of blame placing. And what that does is cause a lot of frustration among community members and anyone who's been involved with a technological hazard or disaster has probably noticed this. And even now in some of the so-called natural disasters, which really there aren't very many anymore, that we know that that affects the collectivity. And that's what, as a sociologist, I tend to look at. And then more recently, dating back to 2008 or so, and even back with my dissertation, one of the things I started looking at was the impacts of litigation following technological hazards and disasters. And some of the research that we have done demonstrates that, in fact, going through claims processes, including litigation and insurance, and other kinds of activities that bring people back to the event all the time. So when we talk about legal processes, they tend to go on and be dragged out. So it's as possible, based on our research, that litigation over years can cause as much stress, if not more, than the actual event itself. And we learned that following the Exxon Valdez oil spill and the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And the litigation doesn't tend to be something that's involved with, again, the so-called natural disasters. There's something called the Stafford Act that kicks in when we have a natural disaster. And that doesn't happen when we have a technological disaster in the same way. We have primary responsible parties, like we did with Exxon Valdez and the Deepwater Horizon and the Tennessee Valley Authority coal ash spill, and I could go on and on. The other thing that is fascinating to us as we study it is when we're doing social impact assessment work and taking the possibilities of different responses and reactions to communities, then we know that there can be angst and disruption in communities without the actual development activity having gone through. So when we studied the Gitgat First Nation up in Canada, when they were dealing with the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline project, some of the data that we gathered indicated that people were as stressed, if not more so, than following the Exxon Valdez spill, simply at the prospect of this development activity coming into their territorial waters and possibly harming their harvesting practices, their cultural practices, and so forth. So what is social impact assessment? I won't read this entire statement, but really what we're looking at is any development activities that have consequences for human populations. So it's important to keep in mind that impacts can be positive and they can also be adverse. Most of the time when we talk about social impact assessment, we don't think about the possible benefits. Typically, those are couched as economic or some kind of role playing in terms of creating jobs for people. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But we know, and it's in some ways common sense, which sociology tends to be, in which people live, work, and play, and they relate to one another. And when we think about these, again, we're talking about communities and groups in communities. So when we're thinking about commercial fishing communities, where there's a lot of subsistent activity going on, those groups who use the renewable natural resources tend to be more vulnerable than those who don't. So I mentioned this just a minute ago. So these social impacts can refer to a lot of different things. And again, I won't read everything, but I think the language used, especially by Ben Clay, who is one of the leading founders of social impact assessment work. And I think that the last phrase, their fears and aspirations, is really what kind of grabs me. I've mentioned already that they can be positive or beneficial social impacts, or negative or adverse, and it can also be a combination of these. It also can be that there are cumulative impacts over time and across multiple activities over years and years and years. So those are more difficult to study because it's different in terms of being able to point to one specific activity that might have influenced the concerns that are going on in communities. So here we have the different phases of social impact assessment. We start with scoping, we move into community history and develop a profile of the region or the community that we're working in. We look then at the development project. Then we conduct site visits where we tend to do mixed methods work that would involve survey research as well as qualitative work where we would do interviews and do some participatory work in communities. Then obviously we'll write that up and we share the findings with community members and other key stakeholders. And it's important for me to say specifically that I don't consider myself a scholar activist. That is something that a lot of my colleagues now are engaged in. And one of the reasons that I'm not comfortable calling myself an activist in the sense of scholarship is that I'm hoping that my work can be seen as objective as possible. And in some respects, that's really difficult to do simply by the fact that the questions my research asks tell a lot about what I'm interested in and the things that I'm concerned about as a researcher. So here are all the words that we're not supposed to be using right now. I dug through everything I could find, and all of these, including any euphemisms, and I saw this from a government official, are not allowed. But of course, these are the kinds of groups that can be majorly affected by these kinds of disaster events. So possible outcomes of social impact assessment. And this doesn't happen all the time, but very often we learn even later that the data that we provided has provided the impetus for negotiation from the communities to the primary responsible party or the government. So we've seen cultural revitalization projects, infrastructure improvement. So for example, in Northern Alberta, up in Canada, we saw a new water system being developed because that was the primary concern by the community. They increased buffer zones around the hazard sites. We have been involved with judicial processes associated with different types of activities. And so we've served as expert witnesses. And there you can see, we'll do workshops, webinars, create guidebooks. And in the end, what we really want to see with these potential outcomes is resilience. So on the left is an image of me speaking at one of the series of workshops that was put on by the Sea Grant in the Gulf of Mexico area. And yes, I'm still going to call it the Gulf of Mexico as well. So the community capitals, what are they? You can see them here, and I'm going to go over them very briefly because I think I've got just a little bit of time left. And these kind of speak for themselves. It's important for me to put the natural capital first so that we can tell the fact that, we want to make sure that the air we are breathing, that the water we're drinking, that the food we're eating are safe to do, right? So in terms of natural capital, we can see that these renewable resource communities are really threatened by the loss of natural capital. The most familiar to people is financial capital, and those kinds of capital involved savings and income. They also involve the work that the government officials do. So the political activities can influence financial capital as well. The built capital, obviously the physical infrastructure and the lifelines in communities. So it's simply, in some respects, the roads and the buildings and the homes and the power lines and those kinds of things that can affect the built capital. Human capital consists of various things, including education, knowledge, skills, health, and physical ability. And those issues can be addressed in communities in some of the easier ways than other forms of capital. Social capital is one of the things that's incredibly important in Indigenous populations, but of course as well in non-Indigenous populations. So it consists of social networks, associations, reciprocity, and trust. And as you can tell from that simple definition, social capital is something that, particularly in subsistence communities, is really important for people to share what they've harvested and to move about in their communities. So up in Hartley Bay, when we did our research there was a community of 250 people. And not unlike Cordova, you can only fly in or take a boat. And so it's important for that social capital to exist in that community. Political capital, again, when communities have more power in a region, for example, they have the ability to get a hold of resources and to influence how those resources are distributed and how they can engage external entities. So not just those within a community that's being affected, but external entities that might provide some support in some way. And then finally, cultural capital, which is also something, of course, that's really important to Indigenous communities. But of course, it's awfully concerning when we have the resources that are damaged, right? So cultural capital involves language and symbols. It involves experiences that communities have had together and the members that have experienced those. And we see those cultural capital pieces involved with the preferences and the attitudes and the orientations of people in different communities. And so you can go from one community to another, maybe it's one fishing community to another. And those two communities, even though they're fishing communities, have different cultural capital. So we need to keep that in mind. So these capitals are obviously related, they're interactive, they don't stand alone. They tend to be collectively available, not to all populations in a community, but generally speaking to communities as a whole. And we can see them, not just the financial capital as assets, but other forms of capital being assets. They can also be used to advance community resilience and sustainable development. And it doesn't necessarily take a disaster or a hazard to make community capitals be of value to a community. It can be used to enhance the well-being and overall quality of life in a community. So again, understanding the various forms of capital in communities can help to inform our efforts to increase resilience. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is a continuum of disciplinary integration. And I think that's particularly important for folks on this call and people who want to be involved with research associated with TSLP. This is how we consider different forms of integration and collaboration in different research projects. So the unidisciplinary projects would be considered either an individual working on research or a group of individuals with the same disciplinary background working on a specific topic. Then we have multidisciplinary projects, and everyone in the project has their own discipline, and they come to the table together, but they're in silos. But you can see the fruit bowl there, right? So we had an apple for the unidisciplinary and the fruit bowl for the multidisciplinary. So then we get a fruit salad. So what we see here is interdisciplinary work with people from different disciplines who work jointly to address a common problem, but they're still working from their own disciplinary background and their experiences. So where we're headed, we hope, is the fruit smoothie, where we've got different disciplines working together to collaborate on a specific problem whether it's a hazard or disaster or some other kind of thing, toxic shocks to an environment. It can also involve shocks and stressors that are related with economics to a community. But the idea is that out of those transdisciplinary collaborations, what we see are new approaches to address what would be seen as a common problem. So I will leave it at that for now. I'm pleased to address any questions you have, and I'll call on Dwayne if there's something that I can't figure out, and maybe I'll call on some of you because the knowledge that's on this Zoom call is really incredible.
Thank you, Liesel.